Three men walked into the diner at midnight and barely glanced at the tired single father sitting alone in the corner booth, his jacket worn, his manner unremarkable. They never imagined he had once trained working dogs for an elite tactical unit, and never noticed the old dog beneath his table, watching every trembling hand in the room. When the CEO near the window was suddenly pulled toward the back door, the man in the corner did not move. But the instant the gun swung, the old dog rose, blocked the only way out, and the diner stopped breathing entirely. If you want to know why the dog never made a sound, stay until the final moment of this story. Rain came down hard on the outskirts of Chicago that night, turning the parking lot outside the old roadside diner into a sheet of black glass streaked with red and blue neon. The road was empty except for the occasional set of headlights sweeping past, and the diner itself looked like something out of another decade. A low building with a chrome counter, cracked vinyl booths, and a bell over the door that rang every time someone came in out of the storm. Logan Carter pushed through that door a little after 11, his old jacket soaked at the shoulders, an aging German shepherd named Ranger padding silently at his side. The waitress behind the counter knew him by name and by order, black coffee and a grilled cheese, but she did not know anything else about him, not the years he had spent training dogs for a tactical unit, not the things he had seen, not the reason he never sat with his back to a door. Logan chose the booth in the corner, the one with a clear line to the front entrance, the kitchen door, and the narrow hallway that led to the back exit. It was a habit so old it no longer felt like a habit at all, just the shape his body took whenever he sat down in public. Ranger settled beneath the table without being told, calm on the surface, but his ears moved with every sound that drifted in from the parking lot. Somewhere across town, a teenage babysitter was watching cartoons with Logan's daughter, and that thought was the quiet engine running underneath everything else in his mind. The reason he kept head down, the reason he wanted no trouble, only a warm meal and a short drive home. A woman walked in a few minutes later and took the table by the window, and Logan noticed her the way he noticed everyone, without seeming to notice at all. Her name was Grace Madison, 35 years old, the chief executive of one of the largest logistics companies in the region, and she looked like someone who had just walked out of a boardroom and straight into a storm. Her coat was expensive but rumpled, her eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour, and she carried a leather folio pressed against her side as though it weighed far more than it should have. She glanced at Logan once, registered an ordinary man with an ordinary dog, and looked away without another thought. The diner settled into a fragile kind of quiet, rain against glass, a radio murmuring low behind the counter, the occasional clink of a coffee cup. Then Ranger lifted his head. Logan followed his gaze through the rain-streaked window to the parking lot where a black SUV had rolled to a stop with its engine still running. His hand drifted to the leash without any urgency, more reflex than decision, and he watched three men in dark jackets step out into the rain. The man in front moved like someone who had done this before, unhurried, methodical, his eyes already mapping the room before his boots crossed the threshold. His name was Mason Blake, and the two men behind him, Connor Reed and Jason Miller, fell into step a half pace back, trying and mostly failing to look like ordinary customers. Mason swept the diner in a single glance, the waitress, the cook visible through the kitchen window, the scattered late-night customers, and he dismissed Logan almost instantly, a tired man in a cheap jacket with an old dog under the table, exactly the kind of nobody who never caused problems. His attention caught instead on Grace on the cut of her coat, the watch on her wrist, the folio she could not stop touching. Grace felt the air in the room change before she understood why. One of the three men looked familiar to her, a face she had seen loitering near the parking structure outside her company's headquarters 2 days earlier, and a cold understanding began to climb up her spine. This was not a random robbery walking through the door. Mason drew a pistol from beneath his jacket without any theater, almost bored, and told everyone in a flat voice to put their phones on the table and keep their hands where he could see them. Connor moved to the front door and turned the lock with a soft click, and Jason drifted toward the register, herding the cook and waitress together with the casual cruelty of a man who had done this more than once. The other customers folded inward, heads down, shoulders curled, the particular stillness of people trying to become invisible. Logan did not stand. He did not even raise his eyes all the way, just enough to track boots and hands and the angle of the gun, and to Mason that stillness looked exactly like fear, exactly like surrender. It made him sloppy in his judgment, made him certain there was nothing in that corner booth worth a second look. Beneath the table, Ranger watched the same three men without making a sound, no growl, no bark, only the patient attention of an animal that had been trained for years to read a room before anyone else in it understood what was happening. Mason sauntered past Logan with something close to a smirk, calling him the old man with the dog, and the insult slid off Logan like rain off the window glass. Then Mason's eyes settled fully on Grace, and something in his posture sharpened in a way that had nothing to do with robbery. He said her name out loud, first and last, with no hesitation at all, the way a man says a name he has been given on purpose rather than one he just happened to notice. Grace went very still, the kind of stillness that comes from realizing a thing is far worse than it first appeared. The robbery had never been about the diner, or the register, or anyone's wallet. It had been about her from the moment those three men stepped out of the rain. Mason reached down, closed his hand around her arm, and pulled her up out of the booth, telling her in a voice almost gentle that she would be coming with them now. Mason gave a short, sharp order that no one in the diner was to lift their eyes, and for a moment the room obeyed as though the words carried physical weight. Logan understood, with the cold clarity of long experience, that acting too soon would only get someone killed, that the only safe move right now was patience disguised as fear. Beneath the table, his fingers moved in a signal so small it would have meant nothing to anyone watching, 2 fingers brushing once against denim, and Ranger shifted his weight without making a sound, a change in posture rather than position. Grace was walked backward toward the corridor that led to the rear exit, Mason's hand still locked around her arm, and as she passed Logan's booth she allowed herself one glance in his direction. There were no words in that look, no plea spoken aloud, only the wide, desperate eyes of a woman who understood she might be walking towards something from which she would not return. Logan held his expression flat and unremarkable, the face of a man too frightened to do anything but watch, because the moment Mason sensed otherwise, the moment any one of the 3 men recalculated who was sitting in that corner booth, everything would happen too fast for anyone to control. Connor drifted past Logan's table on his way toward the kitchen and gave the leg of his chair a careless kick, a small cruelty meant to remind him of his place. Logan let his shoulders sag a little further and said nothing, and the lack of response only deepened Connor's contempt, exactly as Logan intended it to. What none of the 3 men understood was that Ranger had already done the work that mattered, memorizing the particular cadence of each man's footsteps, the scent clinging to their jackets, the way each one carried his weapon, the precise route each had taken through the room since walking in out of the rain. Mason's phone buzzed against his hip, and he answered it while keeping a grip on Grace, speaking low into the receiver about a contract, about a hard drive, about evidence that needed to disappear before morning. Grace's stomach dropped as the pieces locked together in her mind, because she knew exactly which contract he meant, the one tied to a hidden trail of corruption running through her own company's books. She was the only person who still held the files that could send a faction of her own board of directors to prison, and Mason's job tonight was clearly to make sure she never delivered them to federal investigators. Logan, listening without appearing to listen at all, absorbed enough of the conversation to understand this was no opportunistic crime. It was a contract, planned and paid for, with a timetable already running. He cataloged the exits the way he had been trained to a decade earlier, the front door locked tight, the rear corridor open and unguarded, an SUV idling in the rain with its engine running and its driver waiting. Every second that passed without intervention narrowed the window in which anyone could act without getting Grace killed in the process. Then Jason, restless and a little unnerved by the dog's silence, turned his attention to Ranger beneath the table and raised his pistol toward the animal as though daring it to move. Logan spoke for the first time since the 3 men had walked through the door, his voice low, flat and entirely without panic, telling Jason simply not to point the gun at the dog. Mason laughed under his breath and asked what exactly the tired man in the corner thought he was going to do about it. Logan answered in 5 words, telling him only that he was making a mistake, and the room seemed to hold its breath waiting for Mason's response. For a moment the tension stretched thin enough to hear the rain against the windows over everything else. Mason waved Jason off with an irritated flick of his hand, more interested in Grace than in wasting a bullet on an old dog. But Connor had already lost the thin thread of his patience. He stepped toward the booth and yanked hard on Ranger's leash, expecting the dog to yelp or snap, but Ranger only stepped back half a pace, exactly as years of training had shaped him to do under provocation. Logan watched that exchange and understood something important, that the 3 men in front of him had skill but no discipline, that their formation could be broken from the inside if the right pressure was applied at the right second. Near the rear corridor, Mason pulled Grace closer to the open door, and outside in the parking lot the SUV's headlights flicked on, the driver signaling that it was time. Mason started to push Grace through the doorway ahead of him, and Logan gave the smallest possible signal with 2 fingers against his knee. Ranger came up off the floor in a single motion, not toward the man holding the gun but straight toward the open doorway itself, placing his body squarely between Grace and the exit. He did not bark. He let out only a low, steady growl from deep in his chest, and the sound carried more weight in that narrow hallway than any shout could have managed. Mason froze for half a second, genuinely startled by an old dog refusing to move, and in that half-second Connor swung his pistol toward Ranger instead. Logan was already moving, closing the distance in 3 long strides, and he used the metal serving tray from a nearby table to knock Connor's arm sideways just as the trigger went back. The gunshot tore into the wall above the counter instead of into the dog, and the sound of it broke the entire diner into screaming chaos, chairs scraping, a tray clattering to the floor, the cook ducking below the kitchen window. Logan moved through the noise rather than against it, his focus narrowed entirely onto protecting the people around him rather than punishing the men who had created the danger in the first place. What happened next took less than a minute, though to everyone in the diner it felt like it stretched far longer. Logan closed on Connor first, twisting his arm into a lock that forced the pistol from his fingers before he could recover from the shock of the gunshot. Ranger held his position at the rear doorway without wavering, refusing the order no one had given him to chase or attack because his training had always valued position over aggression. Mason understood now, with a sick lurch of recognition, that the quiet man in the corner booth was not an ordinary frightened customer at all. Jason lunged toward the fallen pistol on the floor, but Ranger pivoted and cut him off before his fingers came close, forcing him to stumble backward into the edge of the counter. Logan grabbed a chair and shoved it hard into Jason's path, sending him sprawling, and in the confusion Grace pulled herself free and backed toward the relative safety of the kitchen. Mason, refusing to let the situation slip entirely out of his hands, grabbed the nearest terrified customer by the collar and held him as a shield, shouting at Logan to stand down or watch someone else pay the price. Logan stopped immediately, his hands open at his sides, because he had never been the kind of man who gambled a stranger's life for the satisfaction of finishing a fight. Mason demanded to know whether Logan was a cop or military, his voice tighter now, less certain than it had been 10 minutes earlier. Logan offered no answer at all, only repeated evenly that Mason needed to let the man go. In response, Mason fired a single round into the ceiling, plaster raining down in a fine dust, a crude attempt to reassert control over a room that no longer fully belonged to him. Ranger did not flinch at the sound, did not break position, a level of composure that told Grace, watching from the kitchen doorway, that this dog and this man had lived through things far beyond anything happening tonight. Logan told Mason plainly that the back exit was no longer an option, and Mason, recalculating fast, began dragging his hostage toward the front of the diner instead. Outside, Officer David Harris had already pulled his patrol car into the lot after a neighbor's call about gunfire, but the locked front door kept him from entering immediately, and he radioed for backup while keeping his weapon trained on the glass. Inside, Mason used Grace's name again like a leash of his own, pulling her back into his grip and angling toward the front entrance with his arm locked around her shoulders. Ranger left his post at the rear doorway on a silent command from Logan, circling wide through the diner to cut off the path to the front exit a second time, the same trick playing out in a new direction. Grace stood near the kitchen doorway with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, no longer frozen by panic but watching everything with the sharpened attention of someone calculating her next move. She noticed Logan glance toward the door every few seconds, not from fear but from timing, and she understood he was buying minutes for the police outside rather than trying to end things himself. Mason, still gripping her against his hostage, made his demand plain. If she handed over the password to the data she carried, no one else needed to get hurt tonight. Grace refused without hesitation, because that data was the only proof that a faction within her own board had used her family's company to move illegal cargo for years. Mason let slip, almost carelessly, that someone on her own board of directors had hired him for this job, and the words landed on Grace like another kind of gunshot. Logan, listening from a few feet away, caught the surname Blake and felt an old memory stir, a half-forgotten case file from years earlier connected to a smuggling network that had never been fully unraveled. Ranger's ears pricked at the particular cadence of Mason's voice, as though something in his training recognized the specific shape of danger from somewhere deep in his past work. Grace understood now that Logan was not merely defending a diner full of strangers. He was, without quite saying so, defending the only proof that could save her company from the inside out. Mason tried a different angle, his voice dropping into something almost reasonable, suggesting that Logan ought to think about his own child waiting at home before he did anything foolish. For one breath, Logan's jaw tightened, the only outward sign that the words had found their mark at all. It was the single moment in the entire night where his daughter was mentioned. Never seen, never present, only a quiet pressure behind his eyes that passed as quickly as it arrived. Mason believed he had finally found the lever that would make Logan back down, but the opposite happened instead. And Logan's voice went colder and steadier than it had been all night, telling Mason that men who threatened someone else's family rarely had many options left to them afterward. Outside, a bullhorn crackled to life as officers attempted to open negotiations through the locked glass door, demanding that whoever was inside release hostages immediately. Mason, hearing the demand and feeling the walls of his plan closing in around him, decided in that instant that his only remaining option was to force his way out through the front using Grace as cover. Connor, bleeding from a graze along his forearm, dragged himself across the floor toward a second weapon that had skidded beneath a booth during the earlier struggle. Logan saw the movement from the corner of his eye but could not afford to look away from Mason, and the gun pressed near Grace's side. Ranger read the danger before Logan could even finish forming the thought, breaking from his post and driving toward Connor with enough force to push him back from the weapon entirely. Connor scrambled backward, more rattled by the precision of the dog's movements than by any sense of physical threat, because this was not an animal attacking blindly but one cutting him off with calculated timing. Jason, desperate and out of better options, grabbed a knife from a rack near the kitchen pass and lunged toward Logan from the side. Logan caught a pot of scalding coffee from the warmer and threw it along with a folded tablecloth, blinding Jason long enough to send him stumbling into a rack of dishes. Every move Logan made was built around disabling, never killing, a restraint that had clearly been earned through long practice rather than luck. Mason's composure finally cracked as he watched his entire plan come apart piece by piece in front of him. Grace noticed, in the chaos, that Mason favored his left hand and that the angle of his gun drifted slightly off true whenever he pulled her in close. She drove her heel down hard onto the top of his foot, breaking his grip just enough for Logan to close the remaining distance between them in 2 long strides. Ranger reached the front door first, planting himself there exactly as he had at the rear exit earlier, leaving Mason with nowhere left to drag his hostage toward. Mason's foot caught on the leash that Logan had deliberately left trailing loose across the floor, and he went down hard, his gun skittering free across the tile. Logan was on him before he could recover, locking his arm at an angle that forced him to release the weapon entirely, and Ranger placed himself between Mason and the fallen pistol so there was no possibility of reaching it again. Moments later, the front door burst inward under the weight of responding officers, and within seconds Mason, Connor, and Jason were all face down on the floor in restraints. For a brief moment it seemed as though the danger had finally ended, the diner full of flashing light through the windows and the low chatter of radios. But Logan's eyes drifted past the activity toward the parking lot, where the black SUV that had brought the 3 men still sat with its engine running, untouched by any of it. Inside that vehicle, a voice spoke quietly into a phone, calm and unhurried, saying only 2 words that suggested the night was far from finished. Plan 2. Officers guided the shaken hostages out into the rain one by one, wrapping blankets around shoulders that would not stop trembling. Grace kept one hand pressed against the small hard drive hidden inside the cuff of her sleeve, the only physical proof of everything she had risked herself to protect. Officer David Harris approached Logan with a mixture of gratitude and quiet suspicion, thanking him for what he had done while clearly recognizing that no ordinary diner customer moved the way Logan had moved that night. Logan deflected every question with short, unremarkable answers, the practiced evasions of a man who had spent years avoiding exactly this kind of attention. Grace tried to thank him properly, but Logan simply told her she needed to get to the police station immediately and put the evidence into official hands before anything else could happen. Ranger remained fixed on the parking lot, staring toward the spot where the SUV had idled only minutes before vanishing into the dark. Logan crouched near the booth where Grace had been sitting and found a small tracking device tucked beneath the table's edge, proof that whoever had sent those 3 men had never planned for this to be their only attempt. Grace admitted quietly that she intended to hand the evidence over to federal investigators the following morning, and that if it disappeared tonight, control of her family's company would fall straight into the hands of the people trying to silence her. David offered protective custody, but Logan made it clear he did not believe 3 men acting alone explained any part of what had just happened in that diner. As officers led Mason toward a waiting car, he turned his head and offered Logan a thin, unbothered smile, telling him quietly that Grace would not live to see sunrise. Logan intended to walk away once the paperwork was finished, to slip back into the quiet life he had built for himself and his daughter. But Ranger refused to climb into the truck, planting himself instead beside Grace with the same stubborn loyalty he had shown all night. Grace looked down at the dog and then up at Logan, asking why his dog seemed so certain she remained in danger. Logan answered simply that Ranger was usually right about these things, and against every instinct telling him to walk away, he agreed to see her somewhere safe before the night was over. Logan chose a small, unremarkable motel on the edge of town rather than any of the upscale hotels Grace might normally have considered, a place with 2 clear exits, a hallway camera, and a window overlooking the parking lot rather than an alley. Once inside the room, Grace finally allowed herself to sit down, her hands still faintly trembling as the adrenaline of the night began to drain away. Curiosity got the better of her exhaustion, and she asked Logan gently what exactly he had done before tonight to move through danger with such practiced calm. He offered only the barest outline, that he had once trained working dogs for a tactical unit, and that he had lost people he cared about during a mission built on bad information that was never his to control. Ranger, he explained, was the last dog remaining from that unit, the only living piece of a chapter in his life he had tried hard to close. After everything fell apart, Logan had walked away from that world entirely, choosing instead a quiet life built around raising his daughter alone, far from anything resembling heroism. He told Grace plainly that he had no interest in being anyone's hero again, that the cost of that role had already been paid in full. Grace, listening, found herself sharing something of her own, admitting that she too felt isolated inside the very company that bore her family's name. Her father had built that company on a foundation of honesty and hard work, only for certain members of the board to quietly twist it into a vehicle for moving dirty money once he was no longer alive to stop them. Grace had found the evidence almost by accident and had decided, alone, that she would be the one to set things right rather than letting the corruption spread any further. Logan recognized something of himself in that decision, a person carrying a weight too heavy to share, too proud or too frightened to let anyone else see the cracks underneath. Ranger settled across the threshold of the door like a sentry standing watch, and for a while the room held something close to peace. Then Logan noticed an unfamiliar car parked at an angle in the lot below, its windows dark, its engine occasionally ticking as though it had not been parked there for very long. He killed the lights inside the room without explanation and motioned for Grace to move behind the dividing wall near the bathroom. Neither of them spoke as the silence stretched, broken only by the soft patter of rain against the window glass outside. Then, faint but unmistakable, footsteps stopped just outside their door. A thin plastic card slid against the lock, working it open with the kind of ease that suggested practice rather than luck. Logan had already wedged a chair beneath the handle, anticipating exactly this, and the door gave only an inch before catching hard against the frame. The instant it cracked open, Ranger drove forward into the gap, forcing whoever stood on the other side to stumble backward into the hallway. Logan used the brief opening to pull Grace through the room's secondary exit, a narrow connecting door meant for housekeeping rather than escape. A second man was already waiting near the far end of that back hallway, and Grace very nearly walked straight into his grip before Logan managed to step between them in time. The fight that followed unfolded in a space far tighter than the diner had been, every movement compressed, every second sharper with risk. Logan relied again on observation rather than force, reading angles and momentum instead of reaching for anything that could end a life permanently. Ranger worked the same way at his side, blocking paths, forcing confusion, herding both attackers toward a dead end near the laundry room rather than letting them spread out. Grace, no longer simply someone being rescued, grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and released a thick cloud of white powder into the hallway, buying precious seconds of blindness for everyone but herself and Logan. They broke free into the parking lot through a service door, rain soaking them instantly, and ran for the truck parked at the far end of the lot. As Logan pulled out onto the road, he understood with cold certainty that whoever had sent these men knew Grace's schedule and her location far too precisely for coincidence alone, which meant someone close to her was feeding information outward. Grace, breathing hard in the passenger seat, suspected either her company's legal counsel or one particular board member she had never fully trusted. Officer Harris called Logan's phone only minutes later with grim news, telling him that Mason had been killed during transport between facilities, an executions disguised as an accident. That single fact told both of them that whoever stood behind all of this carried far more power and reach than 3 hired men acting on their own. Logan realized that walking into any ordinary police station now carried its own risk, since evidence handled by the wrong hands could vanish before morning came. Grace said there was still one person she trusted completely, a retired federal judge named Hannah Brooks, who had known her father for decades and who answered to no one inside the company. Logan made the decision without much debate, turning the truck toward the highway and setting a course through the night to reach her before sunrise. The highway stretched out ahead of them through sheets of rain, headlights smearing across wet asphalt, the cab of the truck quiet except for the rhythm of the wipers and the occasional shift of Ranger's weight in the back seat. Grace finally asked the question that had been sitting unspoken between them since the diner, wanting to know why Logan kept risking himself for a woman he had never met before tonight and owed nothing at all. Logan was quiet for a long moment before answering that he had once stayed silent at a critical moment in his life, and a good person had died because of that silence. It was the closest he came all night to admitting the wound he still carried, and Grace understood, without needing it spelled out further, that helping her had become a way of settling an old and unfinished debt. Ranger's ears suddenly lifted in the back seat, and Logan checked the mirror to find a heavy pickup truck holding steady several car lengths behind them on an otherwise empty stretch of highway. He changed lanes once, twice, testing whether the distance behind them would shift, and it did not. Logan pulled off toward an old, mostly abandoned gas station to see whether the truck would continue past or follow them in. While they waited, Grace discovered that her secondary phone, the one she rarely used, had been quietly carrying tracking software for who knew how long. The realization landed heavily, because it meant the informant feeding information to her enemies was someone close enough to have planted that software directly onto a device she trusted. Logan crushed the phone beneath his boot, but the damage, if there had been damage, was almost certainly already done. The pickup truck rolled to a stop at the mouth of the station's entrance, blocking the most direct way back onto the highway. Behind it, two more vehicles eased into position, closing off the angles on either side. Logan made the calculation quickly and chose not to meet the threat head-on with 3 vehicles against 1 truck and an unarmed woman beside him. Instead, he used what the station offered, the angle of the security lights, the blind spot behind the old fuel pumps, a service road barely visible at the rear of the lot. He told Grace in a voice low and certain exactly where to go and exactly when to move, and she listened without hesitation this time. Then, without any command spoken aloud, Ranger leapt down from the truck and vanished into the darkness along the tree line beyond the lot. The men pursuing them assumed, wrongly, that the dog had simply bolted in fear and they peeled off in pursuit of him rather than continuing toward the truck, intent on eliminating what they believed was the easiest target first. In reality, Ranger was leading them deliberately away from Grace, drawing distance and confusion the way he had been trained to do years earlier, under far more dangerous circumstances. Logan used those stolen minutes to get Grace into the small, mostly disused storage building behind the station, pulling the door shut behind them. Inside, he reached up and triggered the building's manual fire alarm, filling the night with noise designed to confuse and to draw any eyes still watching from a distance. Grace used a secure line on the station's old landline to reach Hannah Brooks directly, her voice tight but steady as she explained everything that had happened since midnight. Hannah told her, without hesitation, to be at the federal courthouse by 6 o'clock that morning, and that she would personally make sure the right people were waiting. Logan understood that meant surviving the next few hours was no longer optional. It was the entire mission now. One of the pursuing men found his way into the storage building moments later, having lost track of the dog in the dark. Grace, rather than freezing as she might have done the night before, followed Logan's whispered instructions precisely, moving exactly where he told her and staying silent exactly when he needed her to. Ranger reappeared at the worst possible moment for the intruder, blocking the only doorway out of the building before he could retreat. Logan subdued him quickly and took the phone from his jacket pocket, finding a single waiting text message that read only that Grace needed to be brought back before the vote. That single line told them everything. The board was preparing an emergency meeting to strip Grace of her authority, and if she failed to appear, the company would fall entirely into the hands of the people hunting her. Logan proposed something bold, that Grace needed to do more than simply hand over evidence quietly behind closed doors. She needed to walk into that boardroom herself and be seen standing there, alive and in command. Grace was afraid, more afraid than she had been at any point that night, but she agreed without arguing further. Outside, the first thin gray light of dawn had begun creeping over the horizon, and Logan turned the truck back toward the city center, toward whatever was waiting for them there. Grace walked through the front doors of her company's headquarters just after sunrise with Logan a half step behind her, and Ranger moving quietly at her side, the three of them looking entirely out of place among the polished marble and the early arriving staff. Upstairs, the board of directors had already gathered, preparing to vote on stripping her of operational control before she could so much as explain herself. The man behind all of it finally revealed himself in that room, a longtime board member named Adrian Cross, a man who had once called Grace's late father a close friend. Adrian's manner remained smooth and unhurried even as the truth settled over the room, his threats dressed up in the same polite tone he might have used to discuss quarterly earnings. He looked at Logan with open disdain, calling him the man from the diner and suggesting, none too subtly, that he had no business standing inside that boardroom at all. Logan said nothing in response, simply held his position a step behind Grace, the same quiet vigilance he had carried since the moment the SUV first pulled into the rain-soaked parking lot the night before. Grace stepped forward and announced, clearly enough for every person in the room to hear, that she was still alive, still in command, and that she carried proof of exactly what had been done in her company's name. Adrian gestured sharply toward two private security guards stationed near the door, ordering them to block the exit before anyone could leave or call for help. Ranger moved before either guard could react, placing himself solidly across the doorway in an echo of the very same posture he had held at the diner the night before. Logan recognized both guards almost immediately as two of the men who had broken into the motel room only hours earlier, and his expression hardened into something far colder than disdain. Moments later, Officer David Harris arrived with Judge Hannah Brooks at his side, federal authorization already in hand, and the room's last illusion of control evaporated entirely. Grace handed over the small hard drive she had protected through every danger of the night, placing it directly into Hannah's hands without a trace of hesitation. Adrian, sensing the walls closing in around him at last, bolted for a side door near the back of the room, hoping to slip away before anyone could stop him. Ranger was already there, planted firmly in his path, exactly as he had been at every exit since this entire ordeal had begun. Adrian Cross was arrested right there inside the very boardroom he had once used to plot Grace's downfall, surrounded by the people who had trusted him for years. Grace turned to look at Logan, and in that look was the full understanding that he had not simply saved her life that night. He had saved everything her father had built as well. In the quiet that followed, once the danger had finally drained out of the building, Grace asked Logan something that had been sitting in her mind since midnight. Why had Ranger never once barked, not during the robbery, not during the chase, not even when the danger felt closest? Logan explained gently that Ranger had been trained originally for hostage rescue operations, where a single bark at the wrong moment could cost a life in an instant. Instead, Ranger had been taught to observe, to wait for a signal, to block an exit, and to shield whoever stood at the center of the danger without ever drawing unnecessary attention. Logan admitted quietly that during his final mission years earlier, Ranger had lost the handler who trained him because of one careless decision made far above either of their heads. After that loss, Logan had promised himself he would never put Ranger back into danger of that kind again, choosing instead a small, quiet life far from anything resembling his old work. Yet on the night the three men walked into the diner, Ranger had made his own choice, recognizing on his own that Grace stood at the center of the danger and deciding, without any command, to protect her anyway. Grace felt something settle and ache in her chest at once, understanding that an old dog had seen her fear before any person in that room had managed to notice it at all. Logan admitted softly that he had seen it too, but that timing, more than courage, had always been the hardest lesson to learn. Grace thanked them both, Logan and the dog resting quietly beside him, without rushing toward anything more than gratitude and a steady, growing trust between two people who had survived something neither of them had asked for. Logan began preparing to leave, believing, as he often did, that his part in all of this had finally reached its end. But Grace stopped him before he reached the door, offering him a position as a security consultant for her newly restructured company. Logan hesitated, his instincts still pulling him toward the quiet, ordinary life he had built for himself and his daughter. Grace told him simply that she did not need another hero standing in her boardroom. What she needed was someone who understood exactly when not to pull the trigger. Weeks passed, and the company Grace's father had built slowly returned to something resembling the values he had always intended for it. Adrian Cross and the network connected to him were formally charged, the evidence Grace had protected proving more than sufficient to unravel years of hidden corruption. Grace rebuilt the company's security structure from the ground up, insisting on transparency in places where secrecy had once been allowed to fester unchecked. Logan found himself back at the old roadside diner. One quiet evening, Ranger settled beneath the table exactly as he always had been. This time, the regulars who knew his face looked at him a little differently, though Logan carried that new attention with the same quiet humility he had always shown. The bell above the door rang and Grace walked in, no longer carrying the exhausted, hunted look she had worn the night everything began. She crossed the room without hesitation and slid into the booth across from Logan, as though the seat had always been waiting for her. Ranger lay calmly between them under the table, content, his old work for the night long finished. Grace mentioned, almost lightly, that she had started a foundation to support retired working dogs and the families of veterans who had once depended on them. Logan felt something tighten in his chest at the news, though he said very little in response, the gratitude sitting too deep for easy words. He understood in that moment that his past had not disappeared and never truly would, but that it could still be used to protect something worth protecting. He mentioned briefly that he needed to be home soon to call his daughter before her bedtime, a small ordinary detail offered without elaboration. Grace did not push him to change his life or to become anything other than what he already was. She simply opened a door and let him decide for himself whether to walk through it. The story closed on an ordinary morning, the diner bell ringing again as a new customer stepped in out of the daylight, and Ranger lifted his head briefly to check the doorway out of long habit. This time there was no danger waiting on the other side, only the soft, unremarkable light of an ordinary morning settling over the room. The lesson of that whole long night remained quiet but unmistakable. Sometimes the person everyone chooses to overlook is the only one who truly sees the danger coming. If you believe in quiet courage, the kind that never asks to be noticed, follow along for the next story waiting just ahead.